Trevor Stammers is from the UK. He was a GP, family practitioner for many years, and in recent times has been a lecturer in bioethics at St. Mary's University College in London. And he's the director of their program there in bioethics and medical law. And the title of his talk is Discussion of the Theological and Ethical Issues Related to Pronuclear Transfer and Maternal Spindle Transfer. So thank you, Trevor.
Thank you very much, Donald. Well, I'm very, very grateful indeed for the preceding papers, and especially therefore Brent's contextualization of the fairly focused and detailed genetic manipulations that I've been asked to talk about. But I also want to thank Callum not only for putting this proposal together, but also, if I can express it this way, on such an occasion also for providing a very large proportion of the seed bed that has fertilized my own thoughts about this particular topic. Mitochondrial diseases arise when mutations in mitochondrial genes or the chromosomes limit the energy production in the cell. And in the UK, studies indicate that about 1 in 200 children are born with potentially pathogenic mutations of this kind, but only about 1 child in 6,500 on average is affected by severe mitochondrial disorder. And individuals inherit, obviously, the mitochondria just from their mothers because they're already present in the egg cell when it is fertilized. So using techniques now related to those of cloning, it is possible to circumvent these things. And so although I totally agree with Brent's identification of and anxieties about how medicine is, as it were, mutating into an enhancement business rather than a curative business, certainly anyone who has faced the horrors of mitochondrial disorder in the family will obviously be concerned to know of methods whereby those may be overcome. Now, I'm quite interested in the use of language, perhaps because 2 of my colleagues at St. Mary's are experts on Wittgenstein, and the language used in the popular press to describe these procedures does vary quite considerably. 3-parent IVF is one of the common terms that's used, or 3-parent embryos, or even 3-parent babies. Though, as in the case of pronuclear transfers, we shall see in a moment, this is actually quite inaccurate. But these procedures have also been likened to bone marrow transplants because of the incorporation of third-party genes into a recipient, although, of course, with bone marrow transplantation, it's not transmissible through the germline. But a third group of descriptions uses analogies involving biological systems, which I find particularly interesting. One of them that I've come across is it's just like changing the bacteria in our intestines. Now, that I find particularly mystifying, since that seems to me as a general practitioner to be a pretty rough and ready definition of something like cholera or food poisoning, which is hardly therapeutic. But perhaps even more disconcerting are the analogies relating to non-biological repairs, changing batteries in a laptop. Now, concerning these analogies, even a body such as the UK's Nuffield Council, which is not always noted, although there are some very fine Christians on it, it's not always noted for its spiritual sensitivity. In the report that Callum mentioned this morning, they do mention that the provenance of things like these non-biological repairs and so on are not usually seen as having resonance for social relationships. And one of the themes that's been coming through the day loud and clear is that it is this importance of maintaining healthy relationships. that really lies at the heart of why these things are so absolutely crucial. Now, I want to just spend a few minutes looking at the procedures, which it is important to understand, and I am indeed going to talk about both pronuclear transfer and maternal spindle transfer, but do it in reverse order. So this is the slide for maternal spindle transfer, and this involves the following stages: the eggs with the dysfunctional mitochondria up here from the woman who has the potential to pass it on to her child. Those have the spindle taken out of it with the chromosomes in it, and this is then placed into a donor egg which has had its spindle taken out, but its mitochondrial DNA is healthy, and so you've now got a new third egg constructed from components from the previous two that has both a healthy spindle with healthy chromosomal DNA, hopefully, and healthy mitochondrial DNA as well. So maternal spindle transfer does give rise to a child generated with genetic material from three parents, or three individuals, a chromosomal mother, an egg mother, and a sperm father. Certainly as the penultimate presentation, I just want to reflect back some of the thoughts that have occurred to me from what I've heard this morning in relation to this talk. And I was particularly interested in Callum's reference this morning to the symbolism of the unitive relationship of the mother and father and the procreation of a child being reflective of the love within the Trinity. Now, having been involved in teaching sexual ethics for decades, it has struck me as being, again, reflective of loving good things badly, how symbolism that is very, very powerful in Scripture can go awry in various ways. We can misunderstand the symbol and completely not see the symbolism, or we can see the symbolism correctly but push it too far. And one of the most painful things that I still grapple with is where theologians, of whom Carter Haywood, the feminist lesbian theologian in the States, correctly identifies that eros has a transcendental element in it and is connected with the love of the divine for us. But the terrible part in her book where she then takes it further and says the erotic is the divine spark, and the implication is that the erotic is God. And so one moves from a genuine insight into something that is highly dangerous. And since we are sharing together as friends, certainly some of the theologians who will leap upon an idea and not think about the symbolism, an argument could be made that surely three-parent IVF could be even more reflective of the love within the Trinity because you have a trinity of components. Now, I only say that partially jesting. Believe me, those who believe it will suggest it, and Callum and I were talking about this earlier on, and perhaps in the question time you may want to come back to that issue again. Now, these are the pronuclei of a cell clearly seen there, and are my precursor slide to the explanation about pronuclear transfer, which is even more mind-boggling. But as I go through this, I think the thing to bear in mind, the crucial issue here, is that this is actually certainly involving the destruction of two embryos in order to create, or hopefully create, one healthy embryo. So this seems to be, I would say, from a biblical economy, a very much more adverse procedure than even the previous one that we have looked at. So here we have eggs that are harvested from the woman who wants to give rise to the child, and then one such egg is fertilized with her partner's sperm, so that you have the first embryo there, and similarly a donor egg is fertilized. The books always say with her partner's sperm or with the donor sperm. I'm not quite sure why it couldn't be also the sperm from the first partner in any kind of world where any combination will do. But from these two embryos, the pronuclei are then removed, and the healthy pronucleus from the mother who wants to have the child replaces the pronucleus in the donor and donor partner egg, and the embryo is then transferred into the birth mother. So, as I say, in this procedure, we have a child generated from a genetic perspective from 4 parents and not 3. And in both of these procedures, in maternal spindle transfer and pronuclear transfer, what we actually have is a transfer of chromosomes taking place from one unfertilized egg to another unfertilized egg, or in the case of pronuclear transfer, from a fertilized egg or an embryo to another one. And so it's not so much a process of mitochondrial donation, as the press usually has it, or mitochondrial transfer, but really, I would suggest, of a chromosomal transplant. Now, having hopefully negotiated the hurdles of the exactitudes of the procedure, I want to think about some of the implications from an ethical and then towards the end theological point of view. Now, both of these are relatively new procedures, and they will obviously require very, very stringent checks if they come into being. And as a result of the risks and uncertainty that is envisaged in the UK, the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority recommended last year that any children born by either of these techniques would need to be monitored for a very long period of time, many years after birth. Perhaps shades of the film that we saw earlier this morning come to mind there. However, again, the Nuffield Council very helpfully points out this expectation may prove difficult to fulfill on the part of both families and the research community over several decades, because the voluntary nature of the research relationship makes it difficult to anticipate what level of short or long-term follow-up may be gathered. Well, of course, the answer to that, as we saw from the film this morning, is you don't make it voluntary, you make it statutory. But what of the risks to the women? It's certainly likely that initially large numbers of donated eggs would be necessary for these procedures to become possible. And as we know from IVF work over a long period of time now, the egg retrieval process is not in itself without risks, and about 5% of IVF cycles still cause moderate or severe symptoms of hyperstimulation syndrome, which can result in varying disabilities, and including, in rare cases, death. And medical exploitation, the necessity of producing large quantity of eggs, paradoxically seems to me in a world where advocacy of abortion and indeed fertility techniques and so on have often been predicated on women's rights. It seems to me that in a rather ironic kind of way, abortion, because of its link with subsequent premature birth is now actually leading to probably the birth of more handicapped infants, so the no handicapped children has gone out of the window, and women's rights seem to have led to a situation where women are vulnerable to exploitation, not just in the Professor Wang sense of paying one's female employees to use their eggs, and obviously exerting emotional manipulation as well if they are one's employees, but also putting pressure on women who may need treatment to, as well as use eggs for their own treatment, to donate them for the use of experimental purposes as well. Now also, as has already been mentioned, these techniques, because they do resemble the techniques of somatic cell nuclear transfer and so on, will inevitably lead to the advance of human cloning as well. I think that if we see one go forward, we'll inevitably see the other, and yet most jurisdictions and governments, including the UK, at least claim that they do not wish to see human cloning become a reality, and it is prohibited in many nations. But the advance of these techniques, I think, will make that much more likely. Then certainly for Christians who seek to protect human life as soon as it's created, an ethical question arises if human embryos are destroyed in any procedure, as they certainly will be in pronuclear transfer at a rate of 2 to 1, as we've seen. And certainly in the UK, the Human Fertilization and Embryology Act of 2008 defines an embryo as an egg that is in the process of fertilization. So we see here that the advance of these techniques will lead to many embryos being destroyed, which will be deeply offensive, and is deeply offensive to many Christians. But of course that has been an issue right from the very beginning in these techniques, but with this advance we see for the first time modification of the germline, because parents would be intentionally intervening in the genome of their children. And these procedures are germline gene interventions, which means that any genetic modifications will be passed on to subsequent descendants. And this would be the first time, if these techniques become routine, that such intentional genetic modifications are allowed and open the door to further alterations with unforeseeable consequences in the future, such as the possibility of the leukemia that we saw. Now, intentional germline interventions, as well as cloning, are also prohibited under international law. But the Nuffield Council, almost en passant, seems to blithely mention that based on safety and ethical concerns about germline alteration in many countries, including the UK, it would be illegal to offer treatments that make such changes. And yet, the whole tenor of the report is that we should go ahead and do it anyway. And finally, sex selection pressures will also be a very, very real issue. Because unlike nuclear genes, which come from both parents, we've already seen only the mothers can pass on the mitochondrial genes to their children. So while all children of a woman who has mutated mitochondria inherit them, it's only her daughters who are going to be in a position to pass them on to the future generations. And in the same way, all children born using these techniques will inherit healthy mitochondria taken from an egg donor, but only the daughters can pass on copies of the donated mitochondria to their children. So it's possible, because of this inheritance through the maternal line, that some prospective parents will request sex selection, preferring to select only male embryos if a choice of healthy embryos is available, based on a concern to prevent potential grandchildren's exposure to any risks that might be incurred. And whether or not such medical problems arose, parents might also be rightly concerned about their daughters born after such techniques, and therefore may also face difficult reproductive decisions about whether to use their eggs to have children, that is, the daughters. So based on these and other arguments too, it seems to me that maternal spindle transfer and pronuclear transfer cannot be considered by Christians to be ethically acceptable. And moreover, it should be noted that new alternatives to these procedures are already being pursued by scientists in the treatment of mitochondrial disorders. And as with adult stem cells versus embryonic stem cells, these other alternatives can be considered less ethically controversial. Such techniques involve the stabilization and importing of RNA molecules encoded by the nucleus into the mitochondria by appending a specific targeting sequence onto the RNA, which interacts with PIN phase, which is polynucleotide phosphorylase, a protein crucial for the transport of RNA into the mitochondria. And these techniques, which may arguably, if developed, provide a different method of conquering mitochondrial disease, perhaps should be encouraged. Now that's the end of the ground on which I feel relatively secure, but in order to provoke discussion, I also wanted to raise three more hypothetical or more, slightly more hypothetical things that might well arise on the basis of Ben Mitchell's saying that we ought to assume the technical problems can be overcome. And obviously it is possible that such technologies might lead to the development and realization of the male egg proposal and female sperm, as we saw in the film. And this has been around for a very, very long time. And it seems to me links very intensely with the desire of normalization of the expression of not just homosexual genital sex, but also homosexual parenting. And one of the big paradoxes there is that it seems to me that the pressure to allow lesbian couples and gay men couples to adopt children has largely come from research indicating two things. One is that the children brought up in such families do just as well, if not better, than children in more conventional families. But also that parenting, at its essence, actually is not genetic. The genetic link is not important. Nutritive parenting, nurturing parenting is the key thing, and hence it doesn't matter whether the kids are genetically related or not. If they've got two loving mums or two loving dads, they will be all right. Now, it seems to me then to be a complete irony that you can bet your bottom dollar that when these techniques become available, if they do, to enable genetic parenting by such couples, or indeed any combination of people who want to manufacture a child, that the engines will reverse and they will say, but it's incredibly important that, like other people, we are able to make our genetic contribution as well. So genes are nothing at the moment, but genes will be all then. And it seems to me that there's a bit of an illogicality about that. But the desire to be a parent and to have children is something that does seem to be deeply ingrained within us, and although not everyone shares it, it certainly is not something that falls on the differential of whether we are gay or straight or in between. It's paradoxical, I think, that we may be in a situation with synthetic gametes where we have children generated with no parents at all. Now, both the desire to be a parent and the desire as a child to know how one's parents are, I would say are two very important, undeniable elements of our human nature that we must not let go of. I don't think that probably the films of Mike Leigh, a British film producer, will be very well known in America, but I may be wrong about that. He may have a fan club here. But I use one of his films, Secrets and Lies, as my routine film clip when talking about assisted reproduction technologies, because it tells the story of the search of a part white, part Afro-Caribbean woman called Hortensa to find her real parents. And it's a brilliantly acted film, and there's a scene in it where Hortensa meets her mother for the first time, and her mother doesn't know it, in a cafe, and as the mother is sort of chain smoking and in a very anxious state, Hortensa breaks the news to her that she is her daughter. And I think that film illustrates very, very well the importance of finding our roots. Now, I feel very powerfully about this because a member of my own family in a very similar situation has in the past 5 years found his own parents, and I think that he has both found peace in his soul as a result of that, and he has struggled with many, many battles, and is also, interestingly, coming back to his Heavenly Father at the present time as well. Another film that illustrates this is Oranges and Sunshine, about the dreadful situation in the war when we told children that they had no parents and shipped them off to Australia during the war to protect them. So both of these films quite powerful. Now the biblical analogies with this I want to conclude with, and again I thank Brent for saying to me after we watched the film this morning, do you think that the name of the leukemic woman was chosen by mistake? Or not. And of course, in a film, nothing happens by mistake. And her name was Sophia, wisdom, the death of wisdom. And that then got me thinking about the name of the mother. Does anyone remember what her name was? That was Rachel. Rachel. A U in EWE, which made me on the one hand think of Dolly the sheep. Now, I don't know if that was in the producer's mind, but just as Dolly was the first clone, here was Rachel giving rise to this child. But the two scriptures that came to my mind was it was Rachel who gave the heart-crying plea to God, give me children or I die. And I'm absolutely sure that that might have been in the producer's mind. But of course, we also know from the New Testament that a voice is heard in Ramah, Rachel weeping for her children, as we saw there. And I share Brent's fear that we may indeed be looking into the abyss and shrug our heads and say, whatever. God preserve us from that. But now in concluding, just 3 scriptures very quickly, which I throw out for discussion in relation to some of the comments that were made earlier on, one about rights, and then this recurring theme about adoption and genetic parenting. The Bible has very, very little, as far as I can see, to say about rights, but it just struck me this morning when Susan articulated my own discomfiture with arguing primarily on a position of rights, that one of the key verses in the New Testament that refers to rights, and I think there are only 2, is John 1:12, which says, to as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become the children of God. So on the one of perhaps 2 occasions where the New Testament does speak about it, it is about becoming children, of having children. And when we look at the metaphors and terminology that are used in the New Testament about procreation and having children in a spiritual sense, then we have on the one hand the teaching very clearly from the lips of Jesus himself in John chapter 3, which every evangelical knows, that what's born of the flesh is flesh, what's born of the Spirit is spirit. Do not marvel that I say to you, you must be born again. And unless you are born again, you cannot enter the kingdom of God. But certainly in that passage, in connection with being born again, it's talking about entrance into the kingdom of God, whereas being received into the family of God St. Paul seems to me to consistently use the language of adoption, most especially in Romans chapter 8, verse 15 onwards. Well, verse 14, for as many as are led by the Spirit of God are the sons of God. You did not receive the spirit of bondage again to fear, but the spirit of adoption, by whom we cry out, Abba, Father. So the Spirit bears witness with our spirit that we are the children of God. And I just think that we have got to do some thinking in the light of that, without in any way undermining at all the importance, which again I have emphasized, about our genetic inheritance, quite what the New Testament may be teaching us about the desire to have children, and whether perhaps in God's economy and the way in which his spiritual children are adopted into his family, we do just need to think about the relationship of that with regard to genetic and biological parenting. And with that, my time is run, so I will stop.